Hi, everyone. We have all heard of employment verification, EVerify. EVerify is used as part of the employment verification, and most people have been heard of that as well. Have you ever wondered if employment verification can impact you being hired as green card holder? Or if your immigration status can be impacted due to the employer verification? I discuss answers to that today. And I'm Raluca. I provide legal services in the areas of immigration, family law, and estate planning. And I'm here with Nina Clear, my marketing and office manager. So thank you so much for everyone who is watching and for all your likes and shares and comments. They help other people to see our videos. So we really appreciate your support.
Okay, first things, EVerify and employment verification are not the same thing. Even though you think they would be, they're not, right?
No, they're not.
So can you explain EVerify first?
Well, first, let me explain what is an I-9. An I-9 is usually the first step in employment verification. An I-9 is a form that you and your employer must fill out when you're hired. Its longer name is Employment Eligibility Verification.
And most of us fill that out when we've had to give like our driver's license and our social or our passport or birth certificate or,
Yes.
Those things. So we're pretty familiar with those if we've been working in the U.S. So do both citizens and non-citizens need to fill out the I-9?
Yes. On the form, the employee states they are eligible to work in the U.S., and the employer confirms that they saw the required documents. They also make copies of them, and they provide proof that you're able to work legally in the U.S.
So does the employer need to keep a copy?
Yes, they must keep a copy for 3 years after you hired or 1 year after you leave the job, whichever is later. Also, they must be available for inspection by any U.S. government officials from the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Labor, or Department of Justice, who asks to see these documents. They have to have them available.
Okay, so the I-9 is employment verification. What then is EVerify?
EVerify is an internet-based system that compares the information from your I-9 to U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and Social Security Administration, SSA, records, which then confirms with your employer within 3 to 5 seconds that you are authorized to work in the United States. Most employers participate voluntarily, but it is required for certain employers.
So, and do the results show your employer your immigration status?
No, EVerify does not provide your employer with any immigration citizenship status or document information about you. An employer or potential employer cannot ask your status either under the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. But they can ask if you need to be sponsored or if you are authorized to work in the U.S.
What happens if EVerify doesn't confirm that you are eligible to work in the U.S.? Does that mean you can't?
Not necessarily. There are steps you can take to dispute what is called a tentative non-confirmation, TNC, but if you decide not to contest it, your employer can terminate your employment.
Okay, so just to be clear, if you are here on a visa, a green card, or even under DACA, you must have an employment authorization document, or EAD, to submit to any employer for whom you work when you give them an I-9.
Sometimes an EAD is a temporary work permit, and it confirms that you are authorized to work in the U.S. legally. But there are some non-immigrant visas that gives you authorization to work without an EAD. However, I recommend to all my clients that even if they have a non-immigrant visa, such as an H-1B, they should apply for an EAD. Otherwise, they cannot leave the employer that sponsored them for the H-1B and go to work for another employer. Having an EAD makes it easier to move places for employment. However, the EAD does not give you a legal status to stay. So if you left that H-1B sponsoring employer, you would need to ensure that you still have a visa when you move to another employer.
Or a green card, right?
Or a green card, yes.
So there are two different things, just to be clear for everybody, is we have employment, authorization, and we have legal status to be here in the U.S.
That's right.
Sometimes they're combined, like in the H-1B.
Yes.
But they still look at those two separately.
Separately,
okay?
Yes.
And so what I heard you say, though, is that your H-1B is specific to one employer, but an EAD is not.
That's right.
Okay. So if you're a U.S. citizen or you're not a U.S. citizen, but at some point you got a Social Security number, that Social Security number doesn't give you the right to work.
That's right.
Okay.
Correct.
Plus, the other thing to point out is that if you have an EAD, you usually don't need an employer to sponsor you to be able to work, right?
That's correct as well.
Okay. So if EVerify doesn't provide your immigration status to your employer, how can verification of your status impact that?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that if you work without authorization in the U.S., that can impact your ability to stay in the U.S. or apply for a green card or obtain citizenship.
So if you work when you're not authorized, you may not be able to become a U.S. citizen?
That's right. Plus, those who are sponsored by employers have said that they have certain skills, experience, or education to be able to be sponsored. And therefore, if they cannot prove that they have the things which allow them to get the visa, they may run into problems such as being found guilty of fraud in their application.
And well, as we've talked about in other videos, if they're found guilty of fraud, they can be deported and they can be kept from returning to the U.S. or ever applying for a green card or citizenship again.
That's right. Finding a fraud is going to ban you permanently.
Okay. So, and we've also talked about in the past that USCIS and other agencies will look at all of your documents and applications, right? And they'll see what you've submitted throughout the years, and then they'll compare them.
That's right.
And be like, oh, on this, maybe this I-9, you put this, but on this.
And they do fairly common right now for them to check all these documents. So yes, be sure you're honest and consistent in all your applications.
And I read that one of the reasons that verification is really important to businesses is that the government used to, like in the late 1990s or whatever, in the 2000s, they used to just apply civil penalties if people were hiring illegal immigrants. But now they've moved to not just civil penalties, which can be fees, but also criminal sanctions. Is that right?
Yes, and that is one reason businesses are more strict in ensuring all their employees are working here legally. That's also the advice that an attorney is going to give to a business. And the other is that if they are found guilty of hiring people illegally, they can be banned from sponsoring other workers to come here temporarily or permanently to work. So this is all we have for today. Thank you so much for watching. And if you have questions, please submit them to us here or in a private message. We'll see you tomorrow.